Hey everyone, welcome to the Center for Creative Leadership webinar, Government Leadership After Crisis, Resetting Your Mindset and Expanding Your Toolset. My name is Michelle Bryan. I will serve as your webinar moderator for today's session. At the Center for Creative Leadership, also known as CCL, our sole focus is leadership development, education, and research. As a trusted partner for leadership solutions, we offer a comprehensive portfolio of government leadership development programs that can help you turn your biggest challenges into new opportunities for breakthrough performance. In today's webinar, you will learn the mindset, tool set, and skill set necessary for leaders in government to maintain the safety of their employees while continuing their vital mission. Now, I would like to introduce our presenters today. Bill Adams and Chris Beckert are Leadership Solutions partners here at CCL. Both have extensive experience leading government teams and a combined 20 years experience in teaching leadership to organizations worldwide. So we are so happy you guys are here with us today. So welcome, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Bill.
All right, thank you very much, Michelle, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Adams. I am the co-lead for CCL's government sector. Been with CCL since 2008 when we first established our government sector. We focus on providing leadership solutions for the Department of Defense, intelligence community, federal agencies, state and local governments, as well as the aerospace and defense industry. Before my time at CCL, I was a career U.S. Army officer. I served as an artillery officer in light infantry and airborne units, but I also taught in higher education for 11 of those years, with 8 years on the faculty at West Point and 3 years as the visiting professor of military science at Duke University. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Bill, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Beckert. I'm also a Leadership Solutions partner with Bill at the Center for Creative Leadership. I'm based out of the Greensboro office, but I work with global clients, and for a little over 32 years, I've been involved with leadership and leadership development, leading teams in the government, and now working with the private sector. I was formerly in the U.S. Army. I was a retired U.S. Army colonel. I was in charge of Army Executive Education at the Center for Strategic Leadership at Army War College before joining the team. And we may have a combined total of about 50 years together of leadership development, but I will say that we also represent a hugely diverse workforce and a very deeply rooted group at the Center for Creative Leadership that has been looking at leadership since 1970. So over 50 years of research and education around this great topic of leadership, and we're glad to share the time with you today. Why don't we take a look at today's agenda? And Bill and I are going to cover and provide examples, and also introduce some ideas to you, as well as welcome your inputs as well. And we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So we want to go over our crisis leadership model at first, and then we're going to talk a little bit about this thing we call directional alignment commitment and how important that is to achieving collective results at businesses, government, and public sector organizations. And then we're going to suggest a new mindset for post-crisis leadership and give you some tool sets to think about so that you can lead your organizations either through crisis or continue to lead them to new opportunities. And we want to start right away by asking this question: what is creative leadership, Bill?
All right, thanks a lot, Chris. People often ask me, they say, you work at the Center for Creative Leadership, so what does it mean to be a creative leader, to lead creatively? And so this came from a book by 3 of our researchers about how people lead through crisis, through complexity, chaos, ambiguity, confusion. And creative leadership is necessary because the things that you have done in the past, that have always worked for you in the past, are sometimes no longer sufficient. And suffice it to say, with the way the world has been now for the past 4, 5, 6 months, we have all, as leaders, have experienced the need for creative leadership. Next slide, please. So we already saw in our work and our leadership research that the world was changing rapidly, and the work that Chris and I and our colleagues have done with a lot of government clients has been dealing with a rapidly accelerating world, a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Next slide, please. And I love this slide because it shows just how much has been going on that we were dealing with even before February and March of 2020. So you look at technology accelerations there. They're in the blue on the top left-hand side of the screen there: internet, social, mobile, things of that nature, cloud computing. And then innovation there, all these items listed in green: 3D printing, renewable energy, all sorts of things like that. And then as you continue on up on the right-hand side of the screen there, it looks at future scenarios, all these things that we are already starting to grapple with. And government leaders who are sometimes stuck in bureaucratic somewhat rigid and slow to change bureaucracy sometimes had difficulties dealing with a lot of these types of changes. And that was before 2020. And then, as we know, in February, or actually even in January 2020, we had the first diagnosed case of COVID-19, and we now know where we are here, 6, 7, 8 months later. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so how much has things changed? We've looked at that. Bill is exactly right. I mean, now we're in an accelerated amount of change around the globe. This pandemic, along with social injustice issues, along with the shock to local and state economies, along with changes in organizations that have rapidly occurred, have all created crisis in organizations. And at first we were trying to make sense of it all. And then we started to see these widespread effects. I mean, look now at Zoom, a relatively, middle player in the video conferencing community, now worth more than 7 of the biggest airlines in the world, just as a result of this COVID-19 crisis. Look at the impact that the novel corona crisis has had on the entire business system. I know I'm talking to a lot of government leaders. I know I'm talking to a lot of leaders in the public sector, but think about what your private sector counterparts are going through. I mean, there are some massive changes afoot right now in the market. We're seeing some people that are some organizations that are thinking through how to be survivors or how to reinvent in order to not become casualties. And the question Bill and I are going to ask you today is, how are you thinking about becoming a survivor, a reinventor, and a beneficiary of this crisis so that you and your organization and your employees can now move forward and actually realize opportunities as a result of the crisis? And we've got a great crisis leadership model we want to share with you now. But just think about this bigger impact, and where are you right now in the cycle of crisis?
All right, thanks a lot, Chris. So for all of us, we're caught in the middle of this thing. We're wearing masks. We're worried about sending our children back to school. We're worried about how we even go back to work. I currently, right now, I'm sitting in an empty office building. I think there are 5 people in an office building that formerly housed about 50 or 60 people. And it's just because I'm traveling right now for work. So we've got to figure out how we deal with what comes next. And there will be an after. And so we have to figure out, how do we get through this? Next slide, please. So as Chris pointed out, we're going to refer to the CCL crisis leadership model. And this is based upon a book written by one of our colleagues, Gene Kahn. It was published in 2003. We probably need to write a new book after all this is over. Chris, you and I think we have a book coming.
I agree.
But as Gene defines it, he talks about how an organization deals with major unpredictable events, right? And how that can cripple the organization, that can just cause massive disruption. There was a popular book that was published in 2010 called Black Swan, or The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb. And that was a very influential book, how these events that are seemingly rare, like the idea of spotting a black swan, can suddenly, when they happen, they can suddenly make our world turn on a dime. And so the black swan event that Taleb was referring to in his book was about 9/11. And Gene Kahn, when he wrote his book Crisis Leadership, he was actually referring to how, in the aftermath of 9/11, and how did our government, how did our country react and adjust and move forward from that point. Now, of course, in the pandemic that we're dealing with right now, rather than being a discrete event such as 9/11, I mean, 9/11 happened in a single day, and you look how it changed our world overnight, and we continue to feel those effects, to this day, going for almost 20 years later. I mean, I flew to Colorado just about a week and a half ago, and going through security. Those security procedures did not exist on September 10th, 2001, but they exist now. So you think about, how do we lead through these crises? And it's the whole idea that strategies that we take as governmental organizations, or any organization for that matter, to deal with this sudden and unpredictable event that caused us to be thrown back on our heels. And also, how do employees, managers, and the entire organization deal with this new situation? Next slide, please. So I like to refer to this model here about the difference between crisis leadership and crisis management. So pay attention to the two sides of that diagram. We'll start on the right-hand side first, crisis management. And this is what people normally think of. Hey, these are the things that we have to do, right? In the aftermath of a crisis, whether it's 9/11 or now a pandemic that's sweeping across the country, we start thinking about what are these systems, the processes, the procedures, the structures that we have to implement in order to safeguard people? So you think about what's going on right now with the pandemic. It's like, how do we set up enough testing sites? How do we get rapid results back to people? If we're government organizations, how do we return to some semblance of normal? I do a lot of work with the Department of Defense and the U.S. military, and I live in a military community, or a lot of military live in my community. I live about 8 miles south of the Pentagon, and those folks were kind of frozen in place until June, when the Department of Defense lifted the travel restrictions, started sending people. And so they started figuring out, okay, we've got to work through this, but what kind of procedures do we go through? Social distancing, mask wearing. And I was even concerned, very curious, how did the military deal with initial entry training, bringing people in, whether it's at the service academies or to basic training for any of the armed service branches? How do government organizations start returning to some semblance of normal, and start getting on with their vital missions? So that's crisis management. But let's look at the left-hand side of the screen there. It's not enough just to manage the processes, the structures, the systems. You have to lead people. And that's what all too often is missing. And that is one of the points that we see in our work at the center, is helping leaders to deal with not just the management of issues, but also the leadership of people. So how do we shift mindsets, the behaviors, the culture? And so you look at some of the things that are necessary for crisis leadership about compassion, authenticity, caring, and resolve. How do you demonstrate those on an ongoing basis? Now, we don't have enough time in the context of this call or this webinar to really dive into it, but just be thinking about is that showing up in your organization? How are leaders where you live, where you work, doing these things, right? So how are they demonstrating these for you to reassure the workforce that, that we're going to get through this. We're going to work through this together. We may not know all the answers right now, but we'll figure it out as long as we do it together. So, Chris, back to you. Let's take a look at at how we lead through crisis.
Absolutely, Bill. You're exactly right. And what we found, and now over 20 years of research into crisis leadership on both the public side and on the private side, is leaders get to know themselves most acutely when they're in crisis. And so that's some of the research that Gene Kahn based his book on, and then what Bill described as an expanding and ever-growing portfolio of discussions around crisis and around the elements of crisis and around how that contributes to change. And so what we've discovered is that you can create a map of crisis, and that's the 3 stages that you see inside of this circle, which I'm going to use my pointer to highlight. And you can also we've also established 7 steps that leaders can use in order to make their way through that crisis and get to the other side of an initial crisis and maybe continuing to control the crisis as they go. This is the leadership crisis model that CCL offers as part of expanding portfolios and other programs that we can do that are even longer and in more depth, that ask you to one question: what is your crisis leadership challenge right now? And where are you in that crisis? And how do you want to proceed? And how do you want to lead your organization to proceed through that crisis? So let me offer you a couple of questions to consider as we go through this. And then I'm going to actually ask you to take a poll. And Bill and I are going to invite you to take that poll. Bill and I are going to give you some examples of where organizations we've observed have moved through this crisis model, and where they might be, and where they actually might be continuing to rotate through the crisis model. But at least they have a framework. They have some common reference point that their leaders, their fellow organizations, and their employees can see, this is where we are, this is where we need to be, and this is where we're headed. And that's what you see on this next slide. Some questions that leaders can start to use as they move through the crisis leadership model. Very first question that they might ask when they're in the orient phase is, what is happening? We all did that together collectively as a globe. All global citizens asked that question. We said, what is going on here? What is happening with this global pandemic? And then in the sense-making phase, what does it mean? What does it mean to us? What does it mean to our organization? What does it mean to me as a person? What does it mean to my fellow leaders? What does it mean to my employees? And you start, as we do this in longer programs, we start to break down the elements of sense-making and describe how do you describe to others, where are we in this crisis? You come up with a common reference. And then you start to triage, a great term that comes in from our medical professions And we're now moving out of the assess stage of a crisis into the act stage of a crisis, where we need to do something as a leader. In the government, we quite often can't wait. We can't have delays. There are so many people depending on us at the state, local, government, county, at the city level. There are so many different people that depend on some sort of answer to the crisis. And this is where a lot of leaders found themselves in the early stages of the pandemic. A lot of leaders found themselves in the early stages of still in the early stages of this pandemic, if we think of how long it may take to resolve. And triage, what is the most urgent question, is the first thing that pops to mind when people ask about triage. And
yeah, so Chris, if I could just jump in there, just to chime in, just give some examples here, like the orient phase. I remember personally reading articles in the Washington Post back in January about this weird virus, this pneumonia-like virus that was spreading around China, and there was some speculation in the Washington Post about, is it going to spread to this country? And I can remember reading about that, and over a period of a few weeks, just with great at first didn't pay much attention to it, but then I started paying more and more attention, and then as we got later into January, started thinking that, oh my gosh, it is going to start coming here. And at one point, I can't remember exactly when it was, but then we had the first diagnosed case, of COVID-19 in Washington State, and then it started spreading from there. What does it mean? And so I think all of us can remember, where were we in mid-March? You think about the triage stage. Where were you in mid-March? When was the last time you were in the office? And that was the triage. We all said, all right, everybody, we're shifting to working from home. Now, I work virtually anyhow. I've worked virtually for the past 6 years. But it was even weird for me when the people with whom I work on a regular basis, they suddenly went remote. And that's when the world just seemed to go haywire. And it was roughly about March 13th when I think just about everybody shut down. And you think about, if you recall what you were thinking at that time, we all said, a couple of weeks. Okay, we'll be out of the office a couple of weeks. And I even drove to New York City to get my daughter when it was getting really bad. My daughter was living in an apartment by herself. And when Bellevue Hospital set up a makeshift morgue a few blocks away from her apartment, and there was discussion about a quarantine in New York City, I said, that's it. I'm going to go get her. And 4 hours from the D.C. area up to New York, got her, half hour on the ground, 4 hours back home. And it was a quick turnaround. And but we thought, okay, maybe at the outside, maybe a month, 6 weeks or something like that. Well, here we are. It's August, and she's still with us. So it's like, yeah, we're kind of stuck. We're kind of stuck in that stage right now. So, Chris, I'll turn it back to you to continue working through the model here.
Yeah, and as I've delivered this program to other organizations, both on the public and the private side, what I've suggested to leaders around this question around triage, which Bill was just describing, is ask this question: what is urgent now versus what is important? An urgent question might be, why is the house on, an urgent situation is the house is on fire. But an important question is, why did the house catch fire? So as Bill was describing is, this urgent question of, what do I need? Do I need toilet paper? Do I need supplies? I need to get out of my workplace. I need to be safe. Those are urgent issues. The important question then comes in, how do I return after crisis to what was normal? And is normal the next normal, the new normal, or how are we framing that? And that's when you start to strategize, as Bill was describing. That's when you you've reset. Now comes the strategy piece. How does this impact what we do every day as an organization, our core values, our core mission, or our daily operations, and how is this going to change over time as a result? This can happen in multiple different crisis situations. Then you have to get out and execute again. You have to return to what you were doing. As a government organization, you might never be able to shut down. You might have to go into 24-hour operations to support. We've seen states across the United States doing that. We've seen the world doing this, going into crisis action centers. And then you start to balance, and you start to figure out, as Bill was talking about, this balance between people and processes. That's that execute stage of crisis leadership versus management. And then you get into the after action review. This is that recalibration of, hey, what just happened? How did we do? What surprised us? And what will we do differently next time, so that in the pivot stage, you can be ready to prevent crisis from being such a huge impact again on your organization, on your leaders, on your employees, and on the families and the work and all those that depend on your organization. And Bill and I would love to know a question based on this crisis leadership model. Where are you? So we're going to ask our web host right now to launch a poll. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you should all see the answers that you could provide to this simple question. Which step of the CCL crisis leadership model is your organization experiencing right now? Now, I will say, if you've already been through it once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times, and you're really in the 4th or 5th iteration of managing crisis, where are you right now? So what of these steps really resonates with you? And then think about how leaders at all levels of your organization are achieving new opportunities as a result. Bill, do you have some examples you can share of what you see organizations doing to achieve opportunities?
Absolutely. So during the height of the pandemic in New York City, where my daughter lived back in March, if you recall what the U.S. Army did, they established field hospitals on Central Park. I mean, that's a mind-jarring image right there. I've run the New York City Marathon twice, gone through Central Park. I can only imagine what it looked like to have field hospitals there. But that to me is an example of triage, what's important now, right? Strategize and then executing. And then when the crisis had passed, they were able to start demobilizing those. Think about local governments. I know we have people from local governments. I think there are some folks registered from Fairfax County, Virginia, where I live. And local governments established drive-in COVID-19 testing sites and parking lots. And you see those on the news now in states like Florida and other places where there are people in long lines and the COVID testing is being done on a roadside in a parking lot by state and local and county officials to do COVID testing to figure out where is the disease now and who has it, who doesn't, and then starting to set up the contact tracing that's so necessary, to defeat that. And my wife actually went through that one point when she suspected she might have had it. She did not. And recalibrate. Right now we're trying to figure. So Chris talked about in recalibration, we do an after-action review, trying to figure out, okay, what went right, what could we do better? And you think about right now, we're having kind of a national conversation about the rapidity of getting test results back. And right now, the big conversation is they're not coming back quickly enough for them to be really of use to us. And so we need to get them back faster so we can do contact tracing on those folks who are diagnosed positive with COVID-19. I mean, those are just some current examples. And I'm talking about the nation writ large. But you think about your organization, your agency, your government office where you work. Where are you right now? Just some other examples. You think about, I've mentioned about this changed TSA pre-flight screening procedures. That was definitely a pivot. We pivoted, and established those new procedures, which now, almost 2 decades later, are very familiar to all of us, right? We had to learn how to do that thing. So I see people, writing in with strategizing and a lot of strategizing going on. So those are just some off the top of my head examples. But you just think about where you are and how do you move forward. Chris, back to you.
Absolutely. And another one that jumps to mind for me is seeing private-public partnerships with local and state authorities setting up COVID testing stations in shopping malls and getting volunteer organizations to come out and help out and reorganize and get things organized to do that. I mean, most of our attendees today feel that they're in the strategize phase. Now, this may be the 2nd or the 3rd or even the 4th session of strategy that you've been through, or maybe it's the 1st. Maybe your organization is just now sort of coming out of that sort of phase that Bill described where you've triaged, you've done the most important things, then you've categorized the urgent things, and now you're in the strategize phase. We've got some things for you to think about today in the second half of our discussion that might help you as tools and mindsets to shift the way you're strategizing. We also have some groups some folks that answered in the execute and recalibrate stage. Bill and I are also going to talk about some things that might help in that regard as well. But it's those lessons learned that Bill described that are so valuable at this point that as you're learning what's happening around you, you're also reassessing where does my organization need to go next. And so let's share that. And thank you all for participating in the poll. We've got the answers. We really appreciate the participation. And Bill, give us a sense for how leaders might approach a collective leadership mindset in this direction alignment commitment that CCL knows so much about.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. CCL is at its heart a research think tank, and we have studied all things leadership for the past 50 years, since our founding in 1970. The things that we teach, the frameworks that we present in our classrooms, our programs, are based upon research of what real leaders do in the real world. when asked to define what leadership is, our researchers kind of struggled with that for a little bit, but they finally came up with this idea that, well, we can't, it's kind of difficult to define leadership, but we can say that these are the 3 results of leadership, or the 3 tasks of leadership. And it's this idea about direction, alignment, commitment. And the idea that leadership is a social process. People working together in these shared beliefs and practices, that's the culture of your organization, right? And if you notice it, as you've gone from one place of employment to another, you've probably noticed different cultures. Even if you go from one office to another within the same employer or the same government agency, you might notice different cultures. Those are those shared beliefs and practices that really flavor and influence how we establish direction, alignment, commitment. I'm going to talk about this thing in just a little bit here, but taken all together, right, if you do these things, they will produce collective results, and we can move an entire organization forward. Now, years ago, I was doing a program with some executives from a large federal government agency, and one of the executives said to me, he said, he knew my background, that I'd been a military officer, so he said, well, gee, it had to be easy to be a leader in the Army because people had to do what you told them to do. So pause, wait for the laughter, because when I do this in a live program, I say that quote, I say, all right, what do you think about that? And usually there's some nervous laughter, and I ask people, okay, so what is it about that quote that's making you laugh? And then people generally say, well, it's like they're assuming that you're going to be bossing people around. I said, yeah, that was exactly what that person intended. I may be ordering people around, telling them what to do. But if I'm always telling people what to do, bossing people around, what do you think is going to be the culture, the environment inside that organization? So let's take a look at the next slide, and let's see how this plays out. And this is, our model for the outcomes of leadership. So if we can establish a direction, this is where we're going. So you think about, how do you do that in your organization? Do you have a mission statement, vision statement, values, strategic plans? These are all examples of how organizations traditionally establish a direction. Everybody has to know where we're going. And it's your responsibility as a leader to let people know where you're going, whether you're the lead of the agency, right, the overall lead, or even if you're a leader of a 5-person team. The people that work for you have to know what your direction is, and your direction has to be nested within the direction of the higher level organization. That's how we do strategic planning. But there has to be agreement that this is the way we're going, whatever way that is. All right? And then alignment. So how do we gain alignment? How do we get people working together on a regular basis? So my son, my younger son rode crew in high school and college. He was a captain of his crew team in college. And if you've ever seen a crew show, it's a beautiful thing to watch. You got 8 rowers in a boat plus a coxswain, and the coxswain's giving the direction, right? The coxswain's telling them how fast to row. The coxswain's telling them to speed up, to take a surge, whatever. But then how do they gain alignment? Well, my son was actually the rower who sat at the back end closest to the coxswain. He was in a position called stroke, and that was a person who had a very clean method, a very clean mannerism, and they sat at the far end, at the back end of the boat, so that all other 7 rowers could watch the stroke and synchronize their movements off of that one person, so they could row in unison. And everybody on that 8-person team had a different mission. My son, for example, was a stroke, but then there'd be about 3 or 4 people in the middle of the boat. They were the engine house. They were the biggest, strongest people. They're the ones who put a lot of power into the boat. And so everybody had different roles and responsibilities, but they all had to work in unison. Now, if there are any people who've ever rowed a cruise shell on this webinar, or if you've ever just seen a race, what do you think would happen if just one of those people got out of sequence, got out of sync? It can be a very ugly event, because you think about it, they have a 10-foot long oar, and it's on an oar lock. It's sitting right next to them. They're in this tiny little cruise shell about as wide as their hips. And inside the boat, they've got this about 18-inch to 24-inch piece of wood with about 8 feet on the far side of it. And if that oar hits the water, and it's called crabbing an oar, suddenly you've got this 2-foot-long projectile swinging through the boat, hits somebody in the face, knocks them out of the boat. And I've seen it happen on a crew regatta in Maine. Bloody nose, person dunked in the water in late October. It was not a pretty scene. Had to call off the race. So alignment is critically important. Now, that's an extreme example, but you think about how in your workplace do you keep people aligned? And years ago, I was doing work with one of the intel agencies. We had a 5-year contract developing leaders at all levels. And I remember in lower level programs, when we're doing like basically working with individual contributors, there were people at that level who said, well, I know what my office does is important, but I have no idea about those other people. And that was a common refrain. I heard it quite often. So they knew what they did. They knew their office, their cell, their section was really important, but they didn't have an idea about how they fit in with a larger whole. And what I've seen all too often in government agencies with attitudes like that quite often you'll have these silos. I've also heard them termed as cylinders of excellence, right, where they do a really good job, but a lot of times you'll have silos, offices, stovepipes within the same organization competing against one another. And what do you think that does for the overall efficiency of a large organization? Not very good. So you as a leader have to figure out, how do we gain alignment and cooperation and coordination across these different offices? And then finally, commitment. And that's really important, that on a recurring basis that we as leaders earn the hearts and minds of our people on a regular basis. So I take you back to that quote that I started the section off with. It had to be easy to be a leader in the military because people had to do what you told them to do. Right? Analyze that statement in the light of the need for commitment. When we talk about commitment, it might be, you might call it employee engagement. It's about people willing to give of their discretionary effort, more than just the bare minimum, but actually putting their hearts and souls into the work and getting things done because they care about what they do. If I'm ordering people around, bossing people around, do you think I'm going to get that extra commitment, that extra effort? Probably not. I'll get compliance, but I'm certainly not going to get commitment. So you think about, at least in the U.S. federal government, we have the annual employee engagement survey called the Federal Engagement or Federal Employee Value Survey, the FEV survey comes out every year. And you think about it, if you're in a federal agency, you know this is how your agency is measured every year. Take a look at those measures of those assessments of leadership, my supervisor, senior leadership. Think about how do employees view their role within the agency. There's a Partnership for Public Service comes out with a ranking every year called the best places in government, best places to work in government. All they do is they take and they distill down the lessons of the FEV survey. But you look at the agencies that are perennially at the top of those rankings, the best places to work in government versus the places that are lowest to work. What's going on there? And quite often I come in and I work with agencies, organizations that are not doing well in their FEV surveys, and we start looking at comparisons, but how are you doing on these scores compared to others? So I spent some time there talking about this need to establish directional alignment commitment. The organizations that are ranked as best places to work in the government do this quite well. The organizations that are ranked lowest on the FEV surveys don't do this very well. So be thinking about this whole framework of direction, alignment, commitment. It's essential not only during steady state, but it's even more pronounced now in times of pandemic and adversity, and especially now that we're working virtually. How do we gain that alignment across the agency? It becomes extremely difficult. So Chris, I'll hand it back to you. So we'll move on to how do we reframe our mindset?
Absolutely, and great way to segue into this. I want to honor that there are some folks who just joined us, and we're just now getting into the last piece of our discussion around content today, around this question of how do you create success and opportunities post-crisis, regardless of the type of crisis. We've been talking about that, especially in the public sector. And Bill Adams just finished, and I'm Chris Becker, and we're about to finish this last of the third pieces of this, and then go into questions. And I know we've got questions coming into chat, and we're going to honor those questions today. And if we don't get to your question, we will answer it and send you a reply right after the session is over. So we want to talk about this thing that Bill's describing, which is creating this collective leadership. There are responsibilities on how to move forward. So here is a way to think about moving forward post-crisis, or as you're starting to emerge from crisis. I noticed in our survey, most of us are between strategize and pivot. So we're not really out of our crisis stage. We still feel it. We still feel the impacts of it. Maybe we feel the business impacts. Maybe the government organizations you're in have changed. So let's talk about that. First thing you have to do is to know when you're leaving crisis. And as Bill introduced Gene Klein's book at the beginning, he asks a few questions around this. He provides a few examples. The story is no longer in the headlines. We know that's not the case with either social injustice around the pandemic, the crisis of pandemic, around politics, anything that you pick as your crisis, state, local, and government. There are little things, big things happening. Has the organization returned to its routine operations? We know from Bill's examples that's not going to happen for a while, certainly as a result of COVID. Stakeholder inquiries about the crisis have dropped considerably. That's not happened. So you've got to think about this question that we pose here at the bottom of the slide. What are other ways you know your organization is in post-crisis? Perhaps it's a return, as Bill's talking about, going back to doing what you used to do under the new restrictions and preventive measures in order to stay safe, in order to be able to pursue your business or organizational goals, but do it in such a way that protects people. How do you know you're coming out of post-crisis? Think about that question for just a second, because we'd like to pose to you a very simple model, a planning framework that you might be able to use immediately today. So take a picture of the screen, and we're going to come back to it when we're done explaining those steps. But here's something you can apply right away. You can walk away and start working on this today with your organization. If you're in that strategize phase, which a lot of us seem to be, it's this discussion around a post-crisis planning framework. And we use the acronym ROPES, R-O-P-E-S. And it stands for reassess, organize, plan, execute, and support. And this all happens either in that strategize or that recalibrate stage that Bill and I were describing to you earlier, where you're starting to get a sense things are not going to be the same anymore, and we need to do something about it. And I know we've been in that stage for many months now, many weeks. As Bill said, 13th of March, we all started working from home here at the Center for Creative Leadership. That's over 140 days. We started this early back in April, starting to reassess and plan what's going to be next. So let's walk these through with you. And then we'd love to get your responses. And we love the chats that are asking questions already. We're going to get to those questions today. So reassess. Klein offered a couple of ideas around 8 key behaviors you might adopt as a leader. Now, how often do you walk in and say, today, I want to reflect? Bill and I talk about this all the time in programs. How often do executive leaders get a chance to just take an entire day to reflect? And I mean a good reflection. You write down your ideas. You copy down your lessons learned. You're in that recalibrate reflection stage. What did I just learn from all this? And then use that to go forward. And I think one of the most powerful reassessments that I personally and all of us at CCL personally just gone through is, of course, the death of George Floyd, and how that has tremendously reassessed where we are as a society and how we've got to move forward from that. We've got programs next week, in fact, a week from today, we're going to do a webinar just like this one on equity, diversity, and inclusion, because we're taking on this issue and how leaders can reset the mindset and reassess where they are. That's an example of a reassess. You then have to move into organize. How do you organize your group, your leaders, your team, maybe other leaders within the functions to start planning forward? I'll give you an example. When I was working with U.S. Africa Command and we had the Ebola crisis in 2014, we realized that the military leaders in that room were not the right people to get together to solve the Ebola crisis. It was actually members of the medical community, CDC, U.S. Army Research Institute for Infectious Diseases. We had to get U.S. Health Department officials. We brought them in and made them the smartest people in the room. How can we help you? We had the resources. They had the intellect. They had the expertise. Sometimes the right person is not in the room when you start planning, so you have to think about that. And also, as Bill and I have seen, a red team, someone who can sit in the back and think about all of the things that might go wrong, or give you some, sort of play the devil's advocate to make sure you're not getting into a groupthink situation. You need to organize the right team to plan forward. Seek the experts out, then put your plan together. And actually, what we find in our research is a couple of smaller plans up front gives breathing space for the big strategies to start to come out. So some big organizations, like we're seeing large corporate organizations, are putting together brand new strategies for how they want to approach the market. But while they're doing that, time is ticking. And now it's a chance for you to put little plans in place. Think about employee safety. Think about how you want to approach leading your team virtually. We do a great job in CCL talking about how do you lead virtual teams. Think about the little things that you can put into place now that'll help you set up for the bigger strategies. So as you emerge from the crisis, you have a chance to completely react differently. I saw that when I was in Iraq one time. When we took over a smaller sector, And we needed this new strategy. But while we were doing that, we put little tiny plans in place. We met with leaders. We talked to people. We gauged what was going on. We collected information. We collected data in order for us to be smarter. And that's that. Set those little plans in place to set the stage for the bigger plans, because then you have to execute. And while you're executing, as Bill was describing in his examples, you got to collaborate. It's a perfect example on a boat, on a rowing team. They have to collaborate. That's what Bill's talking about when he's describing alignment. You may have a great plan. Does the team to your left and to your right have a great plan? How much do you know about those plans? And while you're building your post-crisis plan, are you communicating that to everyone else? There used to be a boss I worked with that said, my job is to set other people up for success and find out what else is going on to make sure everybody's included in the decision. So, perfect description. We do a great discussion in CCL around this collaboration, boundary spanning. And finally, you have to support junior managers. And we're coming to the close of this session so we can get into your questions, because Bill and I would love to hear them. And I'd like to invite Bill next to give an example of planning after crisis. But if you don't support your junior managers' employees, they're the most vulnerable group. Your junior managers and employees at government, state, local, federal level, even in some private organizations, they're probably the ones with the most responsibility and the least experience. So how do you support them? Acknowledge their wins. Give them recognition for what they've done well. Encourage their confidence. Encourage their courage to go forward after this crisis and lead at the individual contributor level. Give them the support they need and give them the responsibility and authority they need to execute the plan. And then you can back up and start to reflect and think about what's next and go back through that crisis leadership cycle as you're thinking about how to close it. So what we're proposing to you is to think for a minute. And before we go to the questions and answers, answer these two questions in red. How effective have the efforts at your organization been to plan for post-crisis? Just think about that question for a second. And secondly, what could be done differently? Right now, what could be done differently? What popped into your head when we asked that question? What could be done differently? And can you use some planning framework like we proposed here, or the 7 stages of the crisis leadership model, which give you a broader mindset in order to approach this challenge? What can be done differently right now? And I'm going to turn it over to Bill here to close us out with some thoughts. And we'd like to get your questions. And Michelle's going to take it and throw some questions at us from you guys so that Bill and I can field those. And remember, we're representing a hugely diverse, very deeply rooted group of professionals at Center for Creative Leadership who've been studying leadership for 50 years. So we're going to get your answer. If we don't do today, we're going to send an answer, reply to your answer before the end of the day or here in the next couple of days. So ROPES, a post-crisis planning framework that you can use today. Especially if your organization is struggling or you need some way to supplement brainstorming or getting leaders engaged in how to plan for post-crisis. Bill?
All right, thanks a lot, Chris. Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. I appreciate that. And our organization, just like yours, just like every other organization in the world, has had to deal with a world that changed on a dime. March 13th, our world changed. And we're in the process right now of, Chris talked about on the previous slide, of assessing how effective were our efforts, right? This is the recalibration phase. And what can we do differently and as we continue to refine and pivot towards the future? And our future, the future that we're living right now, is very much different than our future, than our present was back prior to March 13th. And we, like you, have had to learn how to pivot on a dime, how to move into a virtual world. And actually, ironically now, have traveled for business. I'm actually at one of our campuses in Colorado Springs to work with one of the branches of the armed forces with their very senior leaders, because it was important to them to start returning to some semblance of normality and returning to in-person programming, which we're doing. But it's like we've obviously had to make some major adjustments because the world is different than it was. So we talk about post-crisis planning, right? And given the protracted nature of the pandemic that we're in right now, the COVID-19 pandemic, as opposed to a discrete event, we expect that it's going to be a long time before we can truly say that we're post-crisis. And it probably won't be until sometime in 2021. I just think 2020 is probably, we're going to be living like this for the rest of the year and into next year. At some point, there's a vaccine that's widely available and we start achieving some degree of herd immunity across major populations, right? But until that point, we have to figure out how to go on. And so we're starting to already do this post-crisis action planning right now, even though we're still in the midst of this pandemic. So we've shifted and we're carrying on operations while the pandemic is still near us now, or is still with us. Even such, you're right, even such that at some point that a vaccine comes out and we have some degree of herd immunity, we are still never going to return to the way things were, right? After 9/11, we never returned to the way air travel was before. And so even after a vaccine comes out, hopefully in early 2021, I don't know, that's just what I'm hearing, is what I'm hearing on the news, it's still going to be different. There's still going to be some social distancing. The handshake, for example, may go away. We may never greet people with a handshake anymore. We may still continue to wear masks until we know it's totally safe. But you think about, as leaders, and I love this quote from Peter Senge, who's a giant in our field, about how can people just deepen their understanding of reality and participate as the world goes forward. And that's what we as a species and as a nation are doing right now. And so it's important for all of us as leaders of others, and all of us on this webinar have influence over others, whether you have, formal direct reports that work for you, or even just your family, your children, your loved ones. How do you lead those people forward into a changed environment to create these new realities? And that's what we are all living right now. So think about the post-crisis reality that you want to create, that you're working on creating right now. All right. So with that, I'd like to go on to the next slide and just hand it back to you, Chris, and back to our producer, Michelle.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And we're going to turn it over to Michelle, who's going to start. I know we have questions coming in the chat, Bill. So Michelle's going to take over and ask us some of those questions, and we'll give a chance to interact with the attendees today.
Yeah, thank you so much. If you guys have any questions, just chat them to all participants so that we are able to see them. I do have a few coming in. So the first one here is, we have many state, local, and government leaders who are experiencing crisis around social injustice that is a national level issue. How would CCL address this crisis challenge based on today's discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to start that, and I'll pass it to Bill for his thoughts as well. I think that what CCL has done is taken a deep look at creating an EDI model, similar to how we did with the crisis leadership model here, on helping leaders cope and then lead through and be very inclusive around this topic of social injustice. And that is a crisis that we ought to all face, and we recognize that at CCL as one of the leading things in our society writ large right now, that leaders need to face, not only with the pandemic, but also this idea of social injustice. What does that really mean? And so I think that you can apply the crisis leadership model as you move through the stages of how to understand this, but that CCL actually, in fact, a week from today, we're going to do another session just like this one around this topic of EDI in the workplace and how you can shift your culture to realign with those values.
All right, Chris, thanks. I'm a father of 4 adult children, and 2 of my adult children actually marched in protests after the death of George Floyd, and I was proud of them for doing that. That singular event that happened, I think it was on May 25th, that singular event caused a great awakening across this nation. And I think it's caused an awakening that we haven't seen in decades, really, maybe since the civil rights era of the 1960s. The EDI model that Chris talks about, we didn't develop that in response to the death of George Floyd. We actually had people who were working on developing this long before that. I know because I actually had included some of this work in proposals that we submitted to major government organizations back in that we were developing back in February and March, and this work was ongoing even before that. But with the awakening on social injustice and a big shift in public opinion across this nation, our organization, just like many other organizations, had to come to grips with it and make some public statements about what we believe. And so major employers across the country made public statements, as did we, how we viewed social justice within our own organization. But we also found a renewed emphasis on it in terms of what our clients were asking us. And we started receiving a lot more requests in order to do this type of work to develop the awareness of the people within their organizations about this whole issue of EDI. Now, you might look at Chris and myself. We're two white males delivering this content and talking about this, but yet we both come from an organization, the military and the U.S. government, that emphasize equity, diversity, inclusion for the duration of the time that we spent in uniform. I still remember, actually going through training myself and actually delivering this training, but we are now doing this at a much higher level, at a much greater level than I've ever seen it done before, really trying to raise the awareness of people and organizations. Even for one of my major military clients, they've asked us to include equity, diversity, inclusion, and implicit bias training for programs that we are now designing for delivery in October. So we're making a major shift in a long-run program to incorporate this at the request of our clients.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you, guys. So the next one I have, how are you seeing the government organizations that handle classified information responding to the "we must now work from home"?
Yeah, Bill and I both have friends who still serve or are in organizations that have to deal with classified information, and it is a challenge. And it's part of that strategized piece of and also obviously urgent versus important, that triage piece. If your business revolves in the government sector around handling classified information or working in the classified realm, then obviously that is in the urgent piece, that in order to continue, and as Bill's seen many folks start to work from home, you have to find ways, new innovative ways to put plans into place immediately in order to be able to go into and actually still handle that or create safe spaces. And so I know that many folks have done that. They've actually created these safer spaces. They've done shifts. They've changed the shifts around so that not everybody's in classified spaces at the same time. And we have a lot of clients, as Bill described, that handle this classified information and have to think about leadership or leadership elements around working with classified material. And you can't all just work from home. It's not possible. So in this reassessment phase, you start to really think about, okay, what is in the realm of the possible? As Bill said, we're going to find ourselves doing things around protecting our employees for years to come, even after what most people would say the all clear has been sounded. But what I'm seeing most often with folks that I know is that they're creating alternate times. They're sanitizing the space after shifts, and they're also allowing as much of that work to come to home locations as possible if there's a classified system that they can send.
I've seen very much the same, Chris. I live just about 8 miles south of the Pentagon, and I have friends and neighbors who work in these secure classified information facilities, or SCIF. So if you're not familiar with how that works, it's a classified information facility. And they're doing exactly what Chris said. They're going on, only half the people or less are actually going in and working in the SCIF. The other half of people are working from home. And in the intelligence community, or the classified arena, they have two different email systems. They have a high side, which is classified, and a low side, which is unclassified. What they're starting to do is figure out not all the stuff that we used to discuss on the high side, has to be there, right? Because the high side classified information you can only handle in that SCIF. When people are working from home, they can access the low side, not the high side. So they're starting to reassess how much information did we previously say was classified, but doesn't necessarily need to be, that we can then discuss on the low side. So it's staggered. It's just like you think about how schools are trying to look at how we go back to school this fall, and most of what the models I'm seeing are a staggered approach where you'll be, only half the kids will be in school 1 week, and then the next week they go and have virtual instruction, so we only have 50% in. That's the same way the military is doing it with in terms of classified information handling, from what I've observed.
Great point.
Great, and we've got a couple comments that are related coming in. So first one, let's see, a major challenge in executing crisis leadership versus crisis management is buy-in and alignment from leaders above you and not necessarily below you. And we have another comment that said the challenge comes when the top leadership have no leadership crisis model. So those are kind of, aligned. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
I think that, first of all, let's go back to when Bill described crisis leadership versus crisis management. I think that, management practices are really the default that most people go to right away when they're in crisis, a checklist or some kind of set of procedures, et cetera. And then they have to realign to how does this impact our employees? How is this impacting the customers? And I know a lot of government agencies don't necessarily have what they would call traditional customers, but the people that depend on those government organizations in order to provide services and provide guidance, provide organizational support. We've seen, the medical system, obviously, the customer is the patient. And so they've gone to extraordinary lengths in order to create this personalized feel for under crisis leadership, talking to people, still making calls over the Zoom or doing client calls, et cetera, doing virtual, in order to create the right crisis leadership decisions and outcomes as a result. Crisis management is a completely different. So that's why it's a polarity. That's two things that are equally important. And I'd love to get Bill's response as well to that. But I look at that balance all the time as, are we making a leadership decision or a management decision? And we have to keep the two in balance. If we make one, we have to address the other side just as easily.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about the challenge when top leadership does not have a leadership or a crisis leadership model. If you now have this concept, right, this framework that we've introduced here today, and your leaders above you do not, think about the influence that you have within your organization. What is your ability to influence them and share something with them? Say, hey, you might say, boss, I attended a webinar today from CCL. Learn more about a crisis leadership model. What would you think about this? Yeah, and actually take the time to educate them on it and try to influence them to perhaps adopt this as a framework for leading through crisis. There are many examples. I don't have time to go into it, but examples where people in mid-level management have influenced organizations. Nike is a great example of that, how mid-level management, people at the middle level of an organization actually shaped the future marketing efforts towards women's apparel and women's running gear because Nike wasn't going the right direction. So what I would encourage you to do is think about, how can I do this within my own organization to share this framework? Turn it back to Michelle.
Thanks. I think we'll probably have enough time for maybe one more question. The military uses the military decision-making process for much of its planning. How can CCL's ROPES framework support these types of standard government planning processes?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there are a lot of organizations here, state, local, county, city officials that, won't have what I would call a standardized planning system. And even in the government sector, you can use ROPES to sort of supplement those initial brainstorming and leader meetings in order to get the guidance out as quickly as possible in order to start the larger planning processes that you just described. But especially, as you think about all of the organizations that are represented by who registered today, not every one of them has something that they can easily go to that's understandable and can be easily applied in post-crisis.
Yeah, I use the deliberate decision-making process, the DDMP, for many years in uniform. Been out of uniform for 14 years, so I think this ROPES model is parallel. I think it accomplishes a lot of the same things, and it's easy to remember, and that's the beauty of it. And so when Chris presented this whole concept of ROPES to me, I liked it because it's a very memorable acronym that if you don't have a current planning process, you can use this. So I would encourage you, if you use DDMP already and you like it, stick with that. But if you don't have one, like Chris said, you might consider this for your planning process.
Agreed.
Great. Chris, can you go to the next slide? We've got, I just want to close it up. If you guys are familiar, CCL does have over 50 years experience working with leaders at all levels, so we can help address any unique challenges to you guys with government agencies. We do offer government leadership development programs and training, and we are a pre-qualified vendor on the GSA training schedule and can work directly with you, your agency, or partner to help with your leadership development needs. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to give us a call. But with that, we're right at 2 o'clock. So thank you so much, Chris and Bill, for sharing some of these tools necessary for leaders in government to maintain safety of their employees. while continuing your vital mission. So tomorrow, everyone who registered for this webinar will receive a follow-up email with links to the webinar recording, as well as relevant industry articles and additional leadership resources in times of crisis. As you exit the webinar, we do hope you'll take a moment to complete the evaluation so we can continue to make these webinar events well worth your time. So we look forward to your attendance at a future webinar, and thank you, Bill and Chris, again for your time, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
All right, this was great. This actually concludes today's webcast. Thank you all for attending. We will send all registrants an email tomorrow with a link to the recording. And please visit our event calendar to sign up for future webcasts.